Hi, this is Jesper from Velocitypeak, and in today's X Particles tutorial, we're gonna make this. So it's this S, and with a liquid inside of it, and it has a speed ramp as well. Now, if you want to follow along, all the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. All right, let's jump in. Okay, so let's build it. Now, I have a timeline of 180 frames already set up. And I have a few elements that I prepared that we can use later on for rendering. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the geometry. So let's go to the splines menu and add a text spline. And I'm going to type in S. And the inspiration here is 36 days of type. And I figured I could get at least one letter in this time. So S will be it. Now I'm going to change the font to Museo Sans Rounded 1000. I really like this font because of the rounding on all the edges here. Looks really nice. If you don't have this, just use something that looks good to you. I prefer to have the alignment in the middle, and I'm going to try to match my original sample as closely as possible. So that's good. Let's extrude this. Hold down Alt or Option and add it to an extrude object. And I'm going to extrude it 60, like so. We're going to add a glass material to this later on. And because of that, I want to make sure we have some actual thickness. And we can do that by adding it to a cloth surface. So let's hold down Alt or Option again and add it to a cloth surface. And it looks a little bad here on the sides. And in fact, if I display the lines, quick shading lines, you can see that it really breaks. It looks pretty horrific. But let's see how we can fix it. Well, first of all, in the cloth surface, we don't need any subdivisions. We only need thickness. So let's increase the thickness to 8. And now it looks bad again. But we'll fix it. Let's go to the extrude object. And the first thing, let me just select caps only. I'm gonna get a bevel size of 8. It's gonna make it nice and round. And I'm gonna change the caps type from Ngon to the new option, new from Cinema 4D-R21, Delaunay. And that makes it look quite good. Now, what you want to be careful with when you use the cloth and thicken things up is that you may get some pinching. It looks pretty okay, but especially in these type of sharp curves like this, you can get some pinching. I'm going to go to my text spline, and instead of adaptive, I'm going to set this to uniform, which is going to fix that. So for the number here, the higher you go, the smoother it's going to become. But I'm going to keep it at 8. It's pretty good compromise between smooth and not too many segments. So I think that looks good. Let's keep it at this. And I don't need to see the lines anymore, so let's go to quick shading. And I'm going to turn off the cloth for now and bring it back later on when we render. Now, one thing that we're going to do is that we're going to add an object to the bottom part of this S that we're going to emit from. So I want to be able to see through this S. So let's go to the Extrude tab, right click and do Render Tags, and then Display. And we want to tick the Use, and let's set it to lines. So now we can see through this S. Now, another thing that I need is a spline that's going to be right in the middle of this S. And the particles are going to flow along this spline later on. So we need to draw that. So I'm going to hit F4 for the front view. And let's get the spline tool, a spline pen tool. And let's just drag or draw a spline to the best of my ability here. Doesn't have to be perfect. Something like that. Maybe down here, something like so. I'm gonna end it in this area, something like that. I'm gonna hit escape. I'll get my move tool and perhaps fix this one. I gotta select the spline first, and then maybe extend this a little bit. but it doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm gonna be happy with this. Let me get to object mode. I want to move the entire spline. Right now, this is right in the front of this S, so we can see this a little better if we go to F5, so we can see all 4 views. So I want to drag this to the center of this S, and I know it's 60 centimeters deep, so we can set the Z to 30, and now it's right in the middle. Let's go back to F1, the perspective view, and now let's add the object we're going to emit from, which is going to be a torus. And it's coming in too big. I'm going to reduce this size to 24 for the ring radius, and then pipe radius, I'm going to do 8. And let me bring back my 4 views again, because I want to put this in the middle. And let's pull this over here and up. And I want to rotate this one. I can go back to my perspective view, R for rotation, and I'm going to rotate this, move it close to this edge. I don't want to go too close because I'm going to add a vibrate tag to this later. So just close enough. I think that's good. So I want to have some movement on this torus. So let's add a vibrate tag. So let's right click on the torus and go to animation tags and vibrate. Now I'm going to enable rotation, and I'm going to do 30, 30, 30. And not so fast, so 0.5 for the frequency. So let's see what that does. So that looks pretty good. So now, on top of this, I want to add a texture to the torus, and we're going to use the texture to emit particles from, and we're also going to get the color from this texture. So we can double click in the materials manager to create just a standard Cinema 4D material. Put that on the torus. And I'm going to call this one emitter matte for material. And let's double click this. Let me pull this guy over. I'm going to use 2 different channels for this. I'm going to turn off reflectance, and I'm going to turn off color for now and start with luminance. And I'm going to define the colors in the luminance. So in the luminance, I'm going to go to the drop down here and add a noise. And let's go into the noise. And I'm going to bring up the size of this noise to begin with, 563. And let's zoom in so we can see a little better. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually bring up the contrast now. So there's going to be one color for the white and one for the black. And let's set that right away. So the black, I'm going to turn into a purple color, something like that. And then the white one is going to be an orange, something like that. I think that's good. So now you can define how much of each color by adjusting these contrast sliders. I'm going to set this to a 5 and then pull this one in a little bit. Maybe something like so. I think that's pretty good. So that defines the look. We can also change the seed until we get something that we like. And I'm going to do 671. So those are the colors. Now let's turn off the luminance and go into the color channel. And let's add a noise to this one as well. And let's go into the noise. Now I am going to change this noise from a standard noise to a POXO, which have these little nice dots. But I don't need to have this many octaves. I want to have a much simpler noise. So we can do that by reducing the octaves to 2. And I'm going to increase the scale to 581, so it's much bigger. And let's also go to the contrast and get that right up to 100. Now, all the white almost disappeared. Now, the way this works is that we are going to be emitting from the white areas, and the black areas are not going to emit. So I'm going to get some more white in. So I'm going to bring this down to around 50, like so. So now we're going to be emitting from these white areas, but I don't want them to have the same pattern on each frame. So we're going to animate the speed here. If I go to the animation speed, I can set this down to 2, or set this up to 2, I should say. And I want to see what it looks like on the torus. If I play it now, we're not going to see anything. But if I go to editor and say animate preview and enable that, you can now see the animation. So wherever we have any white areas is where we're going to be emitting particles from, and it's going to leave the black alone. And it's going to emit the colors from the luminance channel. Now I'm also going to do one more thing. In the torus, we can affect the projection. It's going to change the display of the noise here. So I'm going to set this to a spherical, and just change it to a little rounded dots like so. So if I play this now, this is what it's going to look like. Good. So we have color for the emission channel, and then luminance is going to be for the color. Now we can actually disable these channels. They're still going to be active. We don't need to see them. And let's bring in our X particles. So let's get an XP system. And under the emitter, I'm going to go to the object tab. And then let's set this to an object. And the object is going to be the torus. I want to organize this a little better. So I'm going to bring in a null. I'm going to call this one GEO objects. And I'm going to take all these guys. I'm just going to drop them inside of that null, just so we can stay organized. Let's go back to the emitter. And we want to emit from not the polygon center. We want to emit from a texture. And when we do that, we get an extra tab here. So let's go into that tab. So we have a slot for the texture. So let's bring in that texture we just made. And then the emit channel and the color channel is what we're interested in here. So the emit channel is going to be the color channel. That's the black and white texture we set up. But the color channel we set up in the luminance channel. So if we play this back now, let's just see what we get. So we get something. I don't know if you can see on the screen recording here. I'm going to go to the display tag, and let's bring this up to a circle. That's going to enable us to see it a little better. And we do have our purple and our orange. Good. So let's go to the emission tab, and I'm going to change the speed to 300. And I'm going to reduce the radius to 1. Usually when you work with fluids, you want to have a radius, you want to have a small radius. It's just going to look better that way. So let me zoom out here. And how are we going to get the particles to travel along the spline now? Well, we're going to do that by going to the dynamic objects and adding a flow field. And in the flow field, you can see we have all these arrows, which is dictating how the particles are going to travel now. So if I hit play, you can see that they shoot off in that direction, the same direction as the arrows. Now, first of all, let's move this flow field up so it encompasses the S, like so. And we don't want to have it at the default flow. What we do want is along spline. So we want to have it along the spline we created before. So let's drag that into the object slot. And you can see that the arrows changed. Now let's play back and see what we get. So something happened, but it's going the opposite direction. And you can actually tell by looking at these arrows, you can see that it's actually going to go in this direction. And that has to do with the points order of the spline. So what we need to do is we need to reverse the point order. So if I select the spline and go up to the splines menu, then we can go to something called point order and say reverse sequence. So now you can see that instantly all these arrows changed. Now it's going to go at least in the right direction. Now it's not doing exactly what we want yet. So let's work on this a little bit more. Let's go back to the flow field. And let me go to the display and turn off the vectors. Those are the arrows. We don't need to see them. Let's go back to the general. Now the strength currently is only set to 100%. So let's bring this all the way up to 100. And that's going to make this a little better. So now they're following the spline pretty well. But we also want to reduce the cell size. Now this is the resolution of the flow field. So the lower this value, the higher the resolution. So if I set this down to 8, it's going to be a stronger effect. And you can see that now it's following it pretty closely. Now it's obviously disappearing, or it's escaping the object, and some are disappearing or leaving the object. And we're going to fix that in a few seconds. But let's first add a little bit of extra movement within these particles. And that we can do that in the modifiers and just add a turbulence. And I don't want to have a lot. If I set this value up too high, it's not going to have the same type of flow in the object. See, they get stuck. So I just want to have a little bit. So let's do 12. And I'm going to reduce the scale. Obviously, I've been playing a lot with this, so I know. But the scale, smaller scale is going to look a little better in general here. So, okay, so I think that's pretty good. Now, how are we going to stop them from escaping the object? Well, we're going to go to our extrude object, right click and say X particles tag, and we want to use an XP collider. And now it's going to react to particles, but it's not going to work yet. If I play this back, see that it's still going to do the same thing. And that's because in the XP collider, we need to set the normals to be, instead of outside, we want it to be inside. Like that. So now they're staying inside of this object. Now, obviously, we don't want to have them bunched up like this at the end, but we're going to worry about that in a few minutes here. So that looks quite good. Now, you may get some of these guys escaping. If that happens, let me see. If I go to Control D, which is going to bring up my project settings, you can see that I have my subframes step set up to 5. Normally it's 1. See what that does. Some of them may disappear, may not. But if they escape, you can bring up the subframe steps. I'm going to bring it up actually to 5. So that's good. Now, what I want to do next is I don't want them to bunch up here. I want to have them flow almost all the way to the end here. But right here, I'm going to slow them down. So if I go to the XP emitter, and under the object tab, we have, under the emitter here, we have a retiming feature. And this is a really good feature inside of X particles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewind, and I'm going to have it at 100% until, I'm going to go frame by frame, until frame 44. And then I'm going to set a keyframe for 100%, hit G to go to the next frame, and then I'm going to go right down to 3% and then set a keyframe. So this is going to be a fairly abrupt change here. So now if I play this back, it's going to go fast, and then it's going to slow down. And this is a really nice feature of X particles in general, and I use it a lot. So now we have the general setup is done, but we need a lot more particles. So I'm going to go to my emitter and to the display and set it back to dots. And under the emission, I'm going to increase this a lot. So instead of 1,000, I'm going to do 300,000. Now we're not going to get that amount because we are emitting from a texture, but we're still going to get a lot more particles. So you're going to get a much better sense of the flow of this now. And I'm going to try to have them stick a little less to the surface. We can try to do that if we go into the collider object. I'm going to bring up the bounce to 100, take down friction to 0, and perhaps bring up scatter to 100. But I think that looks quite good. Now you can see how, because we're emitting from that texture, so yeah, we have kind of different sections of the liquid. It's just not one cohesive mass. We have different sections of it, which is going to look really nice with the different swirls and stuff. So that is the main setup for the particles. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the torus. We don't need to see it. And we certainly don't want to see it in the render either. So let's mesh this now. Let's go to generators and choose Open VDB Mesher. And in the Open VDB Mesher, we need to bring in the emitter like that. So it looks a little big and blobby, but let's try to fix that. Now we're going to change two settings here. The point radius is how big each particle is. I'm going to set this down to 2. Now everything is going to disappear, and that's because the voxel size, which is essentially the resolution of the Open VDB Mesher, we don't have enough resolution to display this. So we need to reduce this down to 1, which is going to increase the resolution. And now we have the liquid. Me actually hide this one so we don't need to see it, so we can look at the liquid only. So it looks a little blobby. Let's go to filters, and I'm gonna enable filters. Let's get rid of that median. Let's add a Gaussian. Gaussian is the smoothest of them all. And on top of this, I am gonna add a curvature. And a curvature is usually pretty good at rounding any kind of pointiness off, so it's a more rounded effect. Now on top of this, I'm also gonna add a smoothing deformer. And let's make sure we put that in the same null as the Open VDB Mesher. And I'm going to go pretty aggressive with this. I'm going to take down the stiffness to 4. And then I'm going to increase the iterations to 30. And that makes everything a lot smoother. So that looks quite nice. Now, the way we're going to color this is if we go back to the Open VDB Mesher, and we can go to the tags, and we have something called transfer point color. And what that's going to do is going to bring in the color from our texture, and we get this vertex color, this point vertex color. And you can see what we have. We can see the colors. It looks a little jagged. So what we can do is go back to the Open VDB Mesher, and then we can adjust the smoothing here. So if I set this up to 60, we're going to have a nice and smooth transition between the orange and the purple. So that looks nice. And this is going to translate very well into our actual mesh. Okay, so next, let's see how we can render it. I'm going to render with Cycles 4D. And let me bring back the scene elements that are prepared before we started. And in here, I just have a camera. So let's look through that camera. And it's just an 80mm camera. And it has a little bit of animation on it. So it's null. It's just rotating just a little bit, not a lot. And I'm lighting this with a simple environment and an HDRI. And I'm using HDRI link from Grayscale Gorilla. And I mean, if you don't have that, just use any HDRI that you have. And I found that studio lightings were in general the best way to go, but you just have to experiment with that. So let's twirl this up, and let's go to a different layout. I'm going to go to my cycles layout, this one. And in this layout, I just have the viewport on the top right, the objects manager, and then the attributes manager at the bottom. The previewer, the cycles preview window is in the center, and then I have the node editor on the left side. So let's create Cycles 4D object material. And let me put that on the, I have material there already. Let's delete that. Let's go down to the Open VDB Mesher and put that material on it. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the node editor, and I'm going to take the point color here, and I'm going to drag it directly into the node editor, and that's going to create an attributes tag for us. So inside of this attributes point color, we are going to get the colors directly now. So I can pipe that into the base color. And if I start this now, you can see that we have the orange and we have that purple already in there. Now, on top of this, I am going to add an emission. So I'm going to add shader and emission. And I'm going to use the same color and put that into the color here. Now, I want to blend the standard object color with the emission. And one way we can do that is by using an add shader. So if I go back to shader, add shader, then I can add the two together. So I'm going to put the principal BSDF on the top, and then the emission in the bottom slot here, if I can hit it. So, and then I'm going to add this to the surface. Now, this is going to be a little too intense. I don't want to have this much emission. So I'm going to go to the emission, and here in the attributes manager, I'm going to reduce that to 0.2. I also want to add some subsurface scattering. So if I go back to my principal BSDF, I am going to add some subsurface scattering so we can see through this object. Now, the subsurface color is currently set to red. So I'm going to set that to like a yellowish color. Something like that. And that looks really nice. Subsurface scattering usually looks really, really nice. It does have a big render hit, but a lot of times is worth it. So let's do that. I'm also going to set up this glass material. So for that, because it's slower to render, let's take down the subsurface to 0 for now, and we'll bring it back after the glass is set up. So let's go up here to our glass object, and we need to turn on the extrude, and we need to turn on the cloth. And let's go add a new material. So cycles 4D, and then surface, and I'm going to start with a glass material. And let's put the glass material onto the extrude. And I'm going to double click it. Okay. So what I'm going to do in the glass material, and before I do that, I just want to show you one thing. In the render settings, if I go to cycles 4D and to the section that deals with light paths and ray depth, I have my max ray bounces set up to 6. 1 is the default. If you have it set to 1, you're going to get a black glass like this. You need to have enough bounces so we can see the transparency here, or we can see through the object. You have to experiment from project to project, but in this case, I set it up to 6, and that looks good. Okay, so let's close that. Now, the glass here, I am going to change the IOR. I'm actually going to take it down to 0.91. So this isn't exactly realistic, but it doesn't really matter. That's not what I'm going for here. But what I do want, I want some roughness on this surface. So I'm going to get a texture, and I'm going to get a noise texture. And if I highlight the FAC here, the factor, I can actually preview this directly on the object, which is really handy in Cycles 4D. And I want the scale to be much bigger. So I'm going to set the scale up to something like 0.98. And when you reduce the number here, you actually bring up the scale. So that looks good. Now I'm going to pipe this also through a ramp. So let's go get a converter and then a color ramp. And put the factor in there. And let's solo the color. So I'm going to bring in this one so I have a little bit more contrast. Something like so. Now, if I take this ramp, the color, and pipe that into the roughness of this glass material, and then I unsolo this, it's really, really rough. So I want it to be rough, but I don't want it to be quite that rough. So what we can do is that we can take this color, and I can just lower this to like a mid-level gray, like 60, around 60 or so. And I think that looks a lot better. So let's leave it at that. And that's actually done. So let's go back to the OpenVDB measure, the material rather. And let's go and enable our subsurface, 0.3. And let's get some more space here. And I'm going to increase the size to say 75, just so we can see this a little better. And let's just do 12 here for the samples. It takes a little while to render because we have subsurface scattering. Okay, so I paused there and rendered out a slightly higher resolution version. So I upped the samples to 30. Now in the example that I showed you, the animation, I think I used 22 samples. And I also did a still frame with like 32 samples or something like that. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that if you're going to render this out as an animation and even as a still, it is a good idea to cache this first. So if you go to other objects and then go and get a XP cache, and I always cache to external files. So if I get some space here, just select where you want to save it to, and then build a cache. It's a much better way to go, especially for the animation. So it's a good idea to do that. And that brings this tutorial to an end. If you come up with some cool results, send me some links so I can take a look. You may perhaps want to do this on different letters or different shapes. Now, all the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. Thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.